Okay, it's 6:30, so I'll go ahead and start. Let me, as kind of before I get started, first off, is everybody okay if I don't use the microphone? That's like one less thing to hang on to. If you have trouble hearing me, just let me know, okay? And then I'll gladly use it, but if I don't need to, that's fine. So welcome everybody. We're glad that you're here. They asked me to talk for no more than 45 minutes, so Paul is going to watch the time and give me a sign in case I start rambling on too much. So I have a few slides. Some of you saw some photographs. There's really a lot of material that we could cover. And of course, some of you were around during some of the floods, whether it was 93 or whether it was 57 or, yes, so you were around. Terry moved to Marshall just before the 57 flood. You were at the Yellow Medicine River during that flood. So and others, have been around here. So you all probably have your own history that you could talk about too. I'm going to be kind of pulling heavily from this book, which is the book that was published for the 125th of Marshall by John Radosowski. And there's a really nice or a chapter in there about Marshall flooding. So, and it has a lot of the history in there too. So with that, I always think, when we go through disasters or something bad happens, we always want to blame someone. Like if there's a flood, well, who drained water where? Or, so who do we blame? Well, as we go through here, it's the 150th year of Marshall. And so who are we going to blame? Well, this is Mrs. Whitney, Mary Whitney. She was the one that christened the city. And you've all seen the statue of her down at the 3rd Street and College Drive. And she christened the city. She just didn't sprinkle water. She had a whole bucket. She threw a bucket of water. And when you throw a bucket of water, what happens? Well, it spreads out all over the place. So I think we talk about Mrs. Whitney when we talk about flooding, because that was 1872. And then in 1875, just 3 years later, that was the first flood after Marshall was incorporated. Of course, there was probably previous floods too. So on the handout, I'm going to refer to your handout for just a second. On the handout, you can see these are the 19 floods in the history of Marshall. 3 of those were in 1993. And I'll probably talk most about 1993, some about 1968, some about 1957, some about 1947, and probably talk less about some of the earlier ones. But as you look through this list, there's really 3 or so kind of common denominators of why did this happen. One was too much rain, heavy rain, especially heavy rain upstream. The second factor would have been a late snow melt, heavy snowpack, late melt, and then so it was a fast melt. That caused some of the floods, and you can kind of see the timing of that. And then the third factor would be ice dams, because as we've experienced through Marshall, and I'll talk a bit about some of the elevation differences in Marshall, but as ice flows come down, when we have a late melt and a ice breakup in the Redwood River, it comes pretty fast downstream, and then it comes to Marshall, and then it flattens out, and that's where the ice dams have occurred. So as you go through here, of course, 1875, that was a snow melt. 1907, and 1909, it rained a lot. 1917, there was an ice jam. And that was interesting because that was the first time that it was proposed to do some correction. Like, we need to do something about this. So what was proposed in 1917 was a ditch north of the city to reroute the overflow of the river so it would go north of the city. And of course, we know, and later I'll talk about in 1969, the diversion channel was north of the city. But that idea first surfaced in 1917. And of course, their other idea was, let's just move the river. And that didn't happen. 1919, and now I'm kind of going back to how people blame, the flood was blamed on excessive ditching, draining of farmland upstream, because that was when a lot of the initial ditching happened kind of during that time frame. So you go on, 1928, ice dam, 1944, that was the first report of sewage backups. At that time, they had a centralized sewer stormwater collection system. In other words, everything went into the same pipe, and when the water overwhelmed it, the sewage was going into the same pipe, and that backed up, and of course, nobody likes that. So then when we got to 1947, and you see we go through a period of time, almost every year, there was an exception there, but 1947, 1948, 1949, 1951, 1952, and 1953, heavy, abnormally heavy rains, and caused flooding every one of those years. And in 1953, they said they'd had enough, and the local leaders at that time petitioned the Corps of Engineers and said, we need to have a correction so that we don't go through this every single year. So the Corps of Engineers did a project following the 1953 flood. And that project was that they dredged the river, they removed vegetation, the trees and the bushes and things that were along there, because the thought was, especially ice dams, that impeded the flow through the river. So let's send the water faster downstream. Of course, that caused problems downstream, but they were, that project was looking at how can they kind of solve some of the future flooding problems in Marshall. And then the other part of that was in between, and in a bit I'll show a graphic, but as we know, when the river comes down from Lind and it gets to about Wayside Park, which is now Victory Park, it starts winding, and there's oxbows. And there's a big one right near the high rise in between 5th Street and 6th Street, past the high rise actually. And that was the source of a lot of ice dams. And so they had a project where they cut an overflow channel in between 5th Street and 6th Street, so the river wouldn't have to go through this longer route, this oxbow. It could go straight across when it happened. And of course, that was, today we would think about that and say that, well, that was environmentally crazy to do that, but that was what their solution was then. So that was following the 1953 floods. Then we get to 1957. This is a flood that perhaps some of you remember. And obviously, what they did in 1953, well, that didn't work. It was heavy rains. There was the first fatality of any of the floods in the history of Marshall. That was a driver of an automobile that was driving through flooded water, and there was a washout, and it was like a 15-foot gorge that he went down into and drowned. 88% of the city was flooded during that time. Some of you probably remember that. So then following the 1957 floods, the city leaders worked hard for the Corps of Engineers to design a project that would take some of that water, the excess flow, when there was an excess flow, take it around the north side of the city. And that's what we know now as the diversion channel. That was the same discussion that was originally proposed in 1917. So the Corps of Engineers designed this project. And the key feature of it was a diversion structure that is just on the east side of County Road 7, that when the water reached a certain level, that it would overflow at that structure and then fill up the diversion channel that would go all the way around the city to North 7th Street near Justice Park. And then there's another structure there where the water from the diversion channel would re-enter the river. Of course, they're still there today. That was a large project, and in fact, it was a massive project that was funded by the Corps of Engineers, completed in 1963. Corps of Engineers certified that. Everybody thought that would solve the problem. In 1968, then another heavy rain. And again, I'm going to get into a graphic in a second, but it was the problem, the city flooded then, and the problem, even though the diversion channel was designed to accommodate 8,000 cubic feet per second of water, the water left the river before it got to that diversion structure near County Road 7 and flooded into the city from the west. And then on the other side, where the water reached, was to re-enter the river from the diversion channel, the river was full at that point, so it flooded from the north side too. So the difference that diversion channel made is that rather than the river flooding into the central part of the community, it flooded from two different directions. It came from the west and it came from the north. And during that time then, there was lots of concern that, again, this is going to be a repeat of 1957. Highway 23 was under construction at that time, and the solution then to kind of solving some of that pressure from this extreme amount of water that was coming down was to divert some of that water south of Highway 23. Because it was under construction, the city sent a backhoe out there and they cut a channel across Highway 23 that released water from the Redwood River south. The big issue there then is, where does that water go? Because if you're on the other side, and again I'm going to show this as a graphic, if you're on the other side, the south side of Highway 23, that is the Cottonwood watershed. Watersheds, you were from the Yellow Medicine area, so you know watersheds in this part of the world overflow from the northwest to the southeast. So Yellow Medicine, when that gets too much water in, overflows into the Redwood. Redwood overflows into the Cottonwood, that overflows into the Des Moines, and so on down the line. The whole issue really became, at what level naturally would that happen? Because what the city did at that point, when they cut the channel through Highway 23, that was not a natural flow. That just unleashed a lot of water down through the Cottonwood watershed. There was lots of damage that happened. There was lots of lawsuits, and the city lost every one of them. So then that, as a result of that, we'll talk about, there was a correction that was made in the Corps of Engineers project. And that was completed then, and I'll talk in detail about that in a second. That was completed in 1997, or just after the 1993 floods. Because in 1993, that was we were in the same situation where, we knew the diversion channel hadn't functioned because the water couldn't get to it, and so the city would flood, and there was no correction. In 1974, Congress authorized a Corps of Engineers project to correct that, but it was not funded. You went through the 1980s and it was dry. It was a drought in the 1980s, and the last thing anyone was focused on was flood control during a drought. So in 1993, that was again the first year I was mayor, we had a flood on Mother's Day, Father's Day, and the 4th of July. during that time, and of course, you know, whether it's the 1919 flood, and some of you saw the pictures, these pictures all pretty much look the same. It doesn't matter if it's 1919 or 1957 or if it's 1993. If your house is has water in it, it's not good, and you don't want to live that way. This is a 1957 flood. There's probably more photos, more coverage of the 1957 flood because again, there was 2 newspapers in town. There was more pictures, and we still have a lot of people in the community that remember that 1957 flood. That attracted national attention. Terry, you said that Hubert Humphrey was in town. The National Guard had these, where do I have it? These vehicles that were like ducks that they use like in Wisconsin Dells, and they were using those, and it caused waves downtown, and it broke windows on the storefronts, and it was really a bad situation. And when flooding like that happens, there's also a lot of public health concerns because, you know, is the water safe? Is there sewage that is intermingling with where people are eating and that type of thing? So lots and lots of concerns. We can come back to some of these pictures, but you do recognize this is the armory, this is the utilities where the water tower was, and of course, this is Main Street. And then the 1993 flood. Again, these pictures look the same. Vehicles are maybe more modern, but in 1993, this was in the area, I believe it was in the Southview area. This is the Camelot Mobile Home Park, just off of Fairview Street. This was a sandbagging effort. I think we all have concluded after that filling sandbags, you don't have time for that. That is probably the most inefficient way. So what we actually did, and I'll show that in a second, is just use heavy equipment to build levees. And of course, there was lots of media attention on Marshall. You saw that in some of the pictures, that anytime there's something of a disaster, you have a lot of media attention from outside of the area. So the real question is, why did this happen? Why does this keep happening? So I'm going to read from the Energy and Water Development Appropriations for 1997. This was a hearing that I testified at in Washington, and I'm not going to read my whole testimony, but I'll just read one paragraph. The topography of the region in southwest Minnesota makes the city of Marshall extremely vulnerable to the melt of snowpack in the spring and the flash flooding that occurs with heavy rains during the summer months. The elevation drops some 700 feet from one end of Lyon County to the other and flattens out in Marshall, which is about the center of the Redwood River Basin. The Redwood River elevation drops 19 feet per mile until it reaches the city. Then the slope flattens out to an average drop of 4 feet per mile. The lack of confining valley and the grade reduction contributes significantly to the overland flooding of the city. So that was part of the testimony that we used to really make our case that this Corps of Engineers project, first off, isn't working the way it was functioning and needed to be corrected. This is an illustration that makes that point also. If this is Marshall, this is the top of the Buffalo Ridge, and you can see a 700 feet plus elevation change between the top of the Buffalo Ridge and here. That's more elevation change than between Winona, Minnesota and the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River. That's 38 river miles. And then there's 38 river miles until the river enters the Minnesota River at Redwood Falls. 38 river miles, there's 38 approximately feet of elevation change. So of course, when they have heavy rain, and I'm talking maybe 4 or 5 inches of rain, or the snow melts real fast up here, then it comes down here real fast. The other illustration, of course, is the railroad goes through here. And the railroad that goes through Marshall, they call that, the railroad people call that the Sioux City to Wilmer line, because that's where it goes. That's where they ship to. The high point on that line is at mile marker 93. And mile marker 93, as you're driving down Highway 23, on the railroad there's mile markers. There are these white signs on the right side as you're traveling that way, and they have a number on it, and that's the mile marker. When you get to those, I'll call them kind of funny hills, or some of you remember there's this rock that is on the left side up on the top of the hill that I know our kids used to go down and paint something derogatory about Pipestone, or when they're in high school. That's right about where mile marker 93 is. From that point to Wilmer, that's the high point. So again, the point is there's a lot of elevation change there. The other thing is that the shape of this watershed is almost like an hourglass. It comes down, and as I mentioned before, this is the Cottonwood watershed, this is the Redwood watershed, and the Redwood watershed, when it gets to Marshall, doesn't vary very far from the banks of the Redwood River. And then it widens out again. So it's almost like an hourglass coming into Marshall. So this Corps of Engineers project, the 1963 project had the diversion channel from right here and went around to right there. And then the other feature of the 63 project is what's called the 63 levee, which is right here. That's on the north side of the river. You see there's this oxbow here, and that's to prevent the river from going that direction. Because if it goes that direction, then it would go across the airport. It would end up in 3 Mile Creek eventually. So that levee is one that is little known. Most people don't even know that it's there. It's off of a township road. But the city has to maintain it and mow it and everything as part of our flood control project. So as I mentioned before, the problem in 1969, the problem in 1993, the river left. The river here came through the city that direction, and left the river here, came through the city that direction. And of course, this area right now is fully developed, or nearly fully developed. And this is in the area where St. Stephen's Church is, Thomas Avenue, Andrew Street, all those streets are here. This is Saratoga Street. This is the old a railroad that's since been abandoned. And of course, there's a development here, there's a development here. But none of that could happen with the risk of this flooding. So then, again, it happened in 1993, exactly the same way. So then the Corps of Engineers project that we worked hard to get funded, that was completed in 1997, then was really this levee that followed right here. That's where the bike trail is on top of that levee right now. And that comes up to County Road 7. And the whole idea there is keep the river in the river until it can get to that diversion structure so it could use the capacity of the diversion channel. In conjunction with that, there's quite a bit of property, land, in between the river that was privately owned before, that was purchased as part of this project. So when the water gets to a certain level, then it backfills, and basically that's water storage that happens in all of this area. And that's important. Then the other key feature is the fixed base weir, which is right here. That is the structure that controls the level of overflow. So that when the river would reach a certain level, that it would naturally overflow into the Cottonwood watershed. That's the levee. And if you've been out to Wayside Park, now it's called Victory Park, that's the concrete structure that is all along that area, and that's set at the height that a disputed but reliable engineering study said that before there was development, that's the natural level of overflow. So that had happened. I'll talk a little bit about when that would happen. But before I get to that, the other part of that project then was to continue the levee after the diversion channel entered the river, continue that all the way to Highway 23. So it would prevent the river from coming in here. So that is the continuation of the bike path on top of it right now. So that was completed in 1996, spring of 1997. Since the completion of that, there's been 4 events where the flow in the Redwood River has exceeded any previous flow. More than 1993, more than 1957, more than 1968, more than 1947, all the other years. So, in other words, it has worked. Now, this is a picture of County Road 7 when, you know, in addition to the problem with sending the water across Highway 23 in 1969 and again in 1993, we did put an emergency levee on top of County Road 7, basically to stop the water. So and that was done in, you can see, in water. I mean, the excavators actually were in water, pulling clay out of trucks and then packing it down. So the other piece of this, though, is what about the water that just falls in Marshall? Because so far, I've just talked about the river, but it also rains in Marshall. So we also have to control, how is the water managed in the city? And about 1/3 of the city flows into County Ditch 62. And County Ditch 62, and I won't make this too long, but County Ditch 62 drains that area starting about where the co-op is, Ag Plus Co-op, that whole Walmart area, Menards area, that all drains through Independence Park, and then the hill or the Tree Street areas, that all drains then into Ditch 62. And where Ditch 62 started, and it was an open ditch, at North Bruce Street near what was the Super America, now it's closed, it was Speedway. It kind of parallels Birch Street, and then that would then flow down Birch Street, and then it would kind of meander all the way, ignore this for a second, and then go out under Highway 23. So in 1968, there was the county, the county is the jurisdiction that has control over ditches and drainage. And the county in 1968 approved a improvement to the outlet to Ditch 62 under Highway 23. And really what that was is to put in new culverts underneath Highway 23, underneath the current ones. So that meant dropping the ditch and then increasing the capacity and lowering it so it would drain faster. And that was approved, but it was never constructed, and probably thankfully so, because that would have had big impact on the downstream. Because once it crosses Highway 23, it meanders about 5 or 6 or 7 miles until it gets to Green Valley and enters the Redwood River. So the project that was designed, first off, used the capacity of Independence Park, and I'll show that in a second. But then this was funded by state and federal dollars largely. It put that open ditch starting at Bruce Street and heading south, instead of being an open ditch, it put that into a 96-inch culvert. So it's underground. That eliminated the problem of mattresses and debris and sofas and getting dumped into that open ditch and then clogging things up downstream. And then once it reaches the area closer to the college, then it's an open ditch, and then it goes into this pond. And you've seen this right by Highway 23, north of SMSU's right here. And there is 400,000 cubic yards of soil was removed from there. And that's to add capacity so that when this water went into Ditch 62, it could be stored there. And then the outlet under Highway 23 was exactly the same size. So it was metered out over a long, long period of time. So the impact downstream wasn't any greater than it would have been normally. So, and that, thankfully, that project has worked well. This is just a shot of Independence Park, and of course, Independence Park really is designed to, the reason Independence Park is there, it used to be 51-acre park when the city purchased it. This is a little bit dark, but you can see it all fills up with water. And that's the way it's designed to do. So for water storage capacity. Now, as I kind of wrap up, I don't want to say, okay, the problem is solved, that we'll never have another flood. That would be Pollyanna to say that, or naive. It would be crazy to say that. But we have greatly reduced the impact of the potential for floods. One of the greatest impact, though, that we still have that is unpredictable happened in 2019. In 2019, we remember 2019, there was quite a bit of snow, and it was a really late snow melt. It was April when the river finally opened up. And when it opened up, there was a lot of ice that came, through the community. And I have a few pictures of that. Again, they're a little dark, but what happened was that it clogged up the river. And the biggest clog happened near Wayside Park, now Victory Park, and it backed up. And when that ice jam, so it used all of that capacity that I talked about earlier. It flooded back into all of that area between Victory Park and the railroad. Because it was big chunks of ice and because it came down pretty fast, there was lots of lumber that came with it, lots of trees, big trees, and then it all jammed up there. The same thing happened on the north side of the city too. So I guess I don't have a picture of this, but at that time, that was the only time that it overflowed that fixed base weir, because it backed up and the water got to a point that it came over the fixed base weir. Sometimes when you hear people talk, or the National Weather Service says, there's going to be a flood warning for the city because the city's going to reach 16 feet. What that 16 feet means is from the bottom of, there's a gauge out right underneath the bridge at Victory Park, from the bottom of where the water is, from the, what's the word I'm looking for, Mark? Where the stream bed is, from that point up, that would be 15 feet. Well, we reached about 21 feet in 2019 before it started going over. And then when it went over, then it filled up Victory Park, and then it went underneath the culverts, and that was all filled with snow on the other side. I'm talking the dip by the Klein addition. So the water really had no place to go. So it just all sat there. And once it started doing that, then the ice dam broke. And when that broke, it was noisy, and it was like everything then was gone within about a half an hour. So, and then the water went down. So we still had the risk of that, and there's really no good way of predicting that or controlling that. It's just watching it. But short of that, we are in pretty good shape as far as the heavy rains upstream when they would get 5 to 7 inches of rain, and then it would come through Marshall. So I've talked quite a bit. Why don't I pause here? I'll open up for any questions or any other observations that some of you may have had during some of those floods. Is that okay, Paula, if we do that? Absolutely. Okay. So, questions or observations?
Other than the flood zones in Marshall?
Thanks, Bill. That's a good question. Let me go back here. So, prior to the flood control project, basically none of this area could be developed, and everybody that was close to that area were in a flood zone, meaning that you had to have flood insurance. It was a requirement if you have a mortgage on your property that you had to have flood insurance. Now people can kind of argue about flood insurance, and I actually said to one of our group this morning, Bill, I've never met anyone who has collected on flood insurance. You know, it has to be on the main floor of your house for like a minimum of 3 or 4 hours, and you know, a lot of people get water in their basement, but you know, is it on the first floor of your house? Probably not, especially if you have a split level home, or you know, so but still people were required because a substantial part of this part of the town, a substantial part of this part of the town was in a flood zone, so they had to have flood insurance. Now there's only, I believe, just 2 or 3 properties that are in a flood zone where they are required to get flood insurance. And one of those properties, so this road has been relocated, but this is Country Club Drive. So one of the emergency, if everything would go wrong, and if it would overflow here, then where does the water go? It would go here, but then a portion of it would come back down Country Club Drive and then enter the river right here at the entrance to Westwood Acres. And there's a house there, and that house received special exemption to be built there from the state legislature. There was some political connections at that time to say denied a building permit. This is way back, well before my time. But that house was built. There's no basement underneath it. That is the only house right now that is required to have flood insurance. Some of you may have heard that some mortgage companies, there's been a whole lot of refinancing happened in the last few years, and some mortgage companies just automatically say you have to have flood insurance, which is a real problem for those homeowners because they have to go through a lot of extra time and trouble and to document that, no, we really don't need that. So, Bill, you had another point.
By area by St. Stephen and Elizabeth Street, has that been filled in, or is that from flood zone?
That is not in a flood zone.
Has that been filled in?
It hasn't been filled, but because the river won't go that direction anymore because of the levee, that's not at risk of flooding anymore.
But most of the homes there are not basements
Well,
because of the
that's probably not because of risk of flooding. It's probably because of either a higher water table there, and they don't want sump pumps or whatever, so. And there are parts of town that have higher water tables. I mean, there are parts of towns where your sump pump runs more than in other parts of town.
we were putting a sump pump in his old house, and kept pumping and pumping and pumping, and when we were down, because the water table was so high.
Yep. Yeah, so that, that's an issue, but it's not an issue that has anything to do with river flooding. So it's just where the water table is, so. Other questions?
Did you ever think about removing all the sand and giving us a good, or ground so that we wouldn't have all this flooding?
That would be quite a project, wouldn't it? Yeah. She would, when you mentioned sand, one of the issues with like sandbags is, and my friend, Mayor of Granite Falls, they've done a lot of sandbagging up there when they had floods. And I always remember him saying, you have no trouble getting volunteers to fill sandbags. You put out a notice, they'll all show up. But then they have to be emptied, and nobody shows up to empty it. So, any other questions? If not, Paula, I'll turn it back to you. And again, there's some material to take a look at there too.
Thank
So.
you so much.